Hello, and welcome to Chapter 4 of our Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe read-through. I'm Jem, the reader at St John's Parish Church in Beeston, and today we're going to be looking at the chapter Turkish Delight. So if you haven't read the chapter, scurry off and read it. I'll wait. Read from, "But what are you," said the Queen again. "Are you a great overgrown dwarf that has cut off its beard?" And read all the way to, "Come on then," said Lucy, "let's find the others. What a lot of adventures we shall have now that we're all in it together." So, as before, I'll be noting the things that particularly struck me as I read this chapter, and I'm sure there are things which struck you that I'm not going to mention, so please do leave your thoughts in the comments. I'll be really interested to hear them. So at the beginning of the previous chapter, as with previous ones we've looked at, Lewis ends with a cliffhanger. The White Witch appears round the corner, we see her and her sledge. It's not quite explained who she is, and she demands to know who Edmund is. "And what, pray you," said the lady, looking hard at Edmund. My name's Edmund," said Edmund rather awkwardly. He did not like the way she looked at him. The lady frowned. "Is that how you address a queen?" she asked, looking sterner than ever. "I beg your pardon, your majesty, I didn't know," said Edmund. "Not know the Queen of Narnia?" cried she. "Ha! You shall know us better hereafter. But I repeat, what are you?" "Please, your majesty," said Edmund, "I don't know what you mean. I'm at school. At least I was. It's the holidays now." That's the end of chapter 3. And at the risk of over-reading that exchange slightly, although, what am I doing in these chats if not over-reading Lewis madly, I'm really interested in the way in which identity is defined at the end of this chapter and the beginning of chapter 4, the one we're talking about today. In a previous episode, I talked about the sorts of identity that were ascribed to Lucy or offered to her, being a girl, a human, a daughter of Eve. And here, Edmund is asked not who she is, but what he is. He's made into an object rather than a person, and again, he doesn't quite understand what's being asked of him. And he says, "I'm at school." And obviously that, to us, is defining his age, is defining his stage in life. He's a boy, so he goes to school, in the same way that Lucy was asked, "Are you a girl?" But I think there's a failure of Edmund here. One of the long list of failures we're apparently recognising in these chapters. He defines himself by an institution, specifically an educational institution, and that is not a good thing in Lewis's fiction. In The Silver Chair, we see Experiment House, the left-wing school that Lewis dreams up of all the things that he dislikes, and where there's bullying and education doesn't go on properly. And we see in Dawn Treader, Eustace, who again is very proud of his school and believes in institutions like the British consulate, things that aren't going to save him. And I think it's worth pausing, because particularly in this chapter, it strikes me that the identity of this book as a war novel really comes into focus. And that might seem a slightly odd way to define it, but after all, it does take place right after the Second World War. Pardon me, the first sentences of the book refer to the war, and the plot involves a group of children who've been evacuated. And I think this really is worth reading through the lens of the Second World War and the global politics of the mid-20th century, because it gives us a sense of what was going into this book and how we might read it. So Lewis's suspicion of institutional man, or in this case, institutional boy, I think is rooted in a suspicion of the political millionaireism and the political idealism of the early 20th century. A lot of British intellectuals obviously were communists in the 1920s and 30s. In the Second World War, where Nazism and communism clashed, and in the political situation that he was writing in, where Nazi terror and Soviet terror were being increasingly discovered and discussed. It's also a theological commitment, I think, due to his evangelical heritage intellectually. Lewis, as we mentioned before, has more than a small streak of the reformed and evangelical tendency in his thought. And there is a tradition, certainly in that theological area, of being concerned about schemes for human perfectibility, not only because they overlook things like original sin, but because they try to institutionalize and systematize the gift of God. I think one of the reasons why the sale of indulgences became such a focal point of not only the conflict of the Reformation, but the stories that we then tell about the Reformation, is First of all, this is a horrible thing to do. It's clearly corrupt. It's clearly theologically questionable, but that it represented a lot of the things that Reformed thinkers were suspicious of in late medieval Catholicism. The idea again of systematizing, of automating, almost of building human systems around the revelation and the love of God. So that possibly seems quite a lot to read just in this small detail, but I think the failure of Edmund's sense of identity here is quite serious, that he defines himself by an institution to which he belongs rather than who he is himself. And the Queen responds by misidentifying him in another way. "But what are you?" said the Queen again. "Are you a great overgrown dwarf that has cut off his beard?" "No, your Majesty," said Edmund, "I never had a beard. I'm a boy." "A boy?" said she. "Do you mean you are a son of Adam?" And so on. So again, it's striking to me that she first attempts to categorize him by saying, "Are you a thing that is larger than its type, and do you have less than that type? Are you a dwarf that's grown too big and also had something taken off it, taken its beard?" That she, in the sort of Aristotelian or Linnaean categorization, doesn't look at him and who he is. She tries to fit him in a sort of Procrustean way to a model that is both too big and too small for him. She assumes that he's failed to be the type in this way and also failed in that way, that she's sort of both stretching and chopping him. Again, a failure of attention, a failure of love in its broadest sense, that's rather different from the way in which Lucy and Mr. Tumnus met, even if Tumnus then fell into moral failing later. I think these two meetings are deliberately set up, like the meals that are also had in these chapters, to show us a positive and a negative image. So she discovers that he's a son of Adam, and again, we discussed earlier the way in which that slots these children who are in a children's book into a much longer and much more glorious theological heritage and indeed a cosmological map of who they are and what's going on around them. And then they have, as I've said, a meal, but a bad meal, where the meal between Lucy and Tumnus was between Lucy and Tumnus, so they shared food. There was an egg each. They had toast that was cut up and they both ate it, and they had both the slices of cake. There was something communal and joyful about it. Here we have literally a cold meal. It doesn't take place within a lovely warm cave in a domestic setting. It takes place outside. It takes place, the food being magicked up somehow unnaturally, and it's food that doesn't satisfy Edmund. It makes him want more and more, and it seems unwholesome somehow. So that there is, again, I think, definitely a distinction being set up, a little thesis and antithesis being set up between the two kinds of meal that these two characters immediately engage in as soon as they go into Narnia. We're being shown both sides of the coin, so to speak. And as he's eating, she is talking, and she's trying to persuade him that he should bring his brothers and sisters and bring them into Narnia, of course, as we know, so that she can do something very bad to them. And he thinks that he's going to be established as a prince, and his brothers and sisters as courtiers. While he was prince, he would wear a gold crown and eat Turkish Delight all day long, and you are much the cleverest and handsomest young man I've ever met. I think I would like to make you the prince some day when you bring the others to visit me. You are to be the prince and later on the king, that is understood. But you must have courtiers and nobles. I will make your brother a duke and your sisters duchesses. There is nothing special about them, said Edmund. And anyway, I could always bring them another time. And the plot continues where she tries to persuade him that he will have all the things he wants, his princeship and his golden throne and his Turkish Delight, if he will only bring his siblings to her. And again, we see, I think, Edmund indulging in Edmund's characteristic flaws here. He likes power. He's attracted to that idea. We've already seen him castigating weakness and leaping on weakness and using it to sort of build up his own sense of himself and his own power. Here we see him meeting someone who is a tyrant and falling in with their way of thinking, falling in with their attitude to the world. And when he gets the opportunity to install his siblings as the royal family, he says, oh no, there's nothing special about them. I don't see why they should be as important as me. He wants to be the first amongst them. He wants to be the one who stands out, the only prince. even if they're going to be duchesses and courtiers and whatnot. And that love for power causes him to betray his family, only in a small way so far. But in the same way that he turned on Lucy because she seemed weak and he could sort of taunt her and torment her, here we have a situation where his desire and his interest in power causes him to slight his family, to turn his back on them, to even in this imagined world, to say, oh no, I don't think they should be as important as me. I talked previously about Lewis's moral psychology and his interest in pettiness and selfishness as the root of sin, and I think we have something similar here. Those small givings in to bad feeling, to selfishness, to self-aggrandizement, to ego, that are making the next sin easier. There's a sense in which Edmund both has this flaw in his character, but it's a flaw that he's indulging, and it's taking him over somehow, so that when it comes to greater betrayals, it won't be quite so difficult. It will seem a natural, reasonable thing for him to do, to him at least. And so we're getting small betrayals seeded all the way through this story. There's an obvious parallel, obviously, between the role Edmund plays in the story and the role of Judas in the Passion narratives. But this is a much longer and more psychologized journey, I think, for Edmund. And Edmund, as I say, we can sometimes feel as if Edmund's being set up by the author, as if the author needs a scapegoat. Oh, a good Passion narrative word. And Edmund is being arranged to be the most evil character possible, and so we can all sort of curse him and condemn him. But Edmund is an interestingly inflected character in this book, I think. I've talked about his hypocrisy and the way he seems to be often doing something outwardly that doesn't accord with what he actually wants. But that does give him a level of psychological depth that's not always accorded to the other characters. We see something of the human struggle, I think, in Edmund that we don't necessarily see in the other Pevensey children. And I think we can recognise some of his, if not dilemmas, some of his failings and some of his moral complexities in ourselves. And it's really interesting to me that Lewis chose to build that into the Judas character, essentially, the betrayer, that perhaps the most psychologically identifiable character in the entire novel is Judas. And that's interesting to me. You know, you might think it would be the equivalent of Paul or Peter, but no, for Lewis's account of biblical narrative, it's Judas. And what he eats, of course, is Turkish Delight, the title of this chapter, and the subject which a lot of people remember about this novel. There are a few things I'd like to say about Turkish Delight. First of all, the debate continues whether authentic, actual Turkish delight from that region of the world is nicer than Fry's Turkish Delight, and that's not a debate that I think we're going to settle today. But also that Turkish Delight brings, again, this novel into focus for me as a war novel. Stay with me here. I swear there's a reason for that. Because the giving of sweets to children, I think for us, might immediately summon up the idea of child exploitation, of kidnap. Again, you know, Lucy has already met someone who says, I kidnap little children, and there's a genuinely frightening moment there for her. I think that sweets are implicated in a larger moral economy here than that perhaps immediately springs to our mind. After all, this is being written in the late 1940s, published in 1950. Rationing is still in force, quite strictly in Britain. Certainly, we've also been through the period of the war where rationing was even stricter. Access to things like sweets, comics, would seem to be both luxurious and potentially forbidden in this area for children. Certainly, an abundance of these things. We watch episode of Dad's Army, there are jokes about American servicemen or Private Wilkins who can get you gin and stockings and petrol coupons and all these kind of things, because you should only have a sufficiency of those things. You shouldn't be able to access luxury goods and lots of them, because this is the war effort overall. So I think having access to unlimited sweets, which is something that we can see popping up perhaps even in the Harry Potter novels, the idea of just a childhood dream of what if I could have all the bangers and mash in the world, what if I could fly on a broomstick, has a more particular moral and political valence in this story, because someone who can offer you unlimited sweets is doing wrong on quite a grand scale. They are someone who is breaking the war regulations, breaking the Defence of the Realm Act, possibly involved with gangsters, and certainly you might call them unpatriotic. You might say that they are people who are, certainly in the terms of government propaganda, strengthening the hand of the German war effort and weakening their own nation. Whether that was the case on an individual level is another matter. But I think presenting a child in this period with the image of unlimited sweets, if they will only betray their people, is a microcosm of the general moral discourse about what was going on in Europe and indeed the world at the time. So I think that both focuses this as specifically a war and a post-war novel, and also makes Edmund's choice and the way he slips into betraying his people, his family, much more sinister and much more loaded for us. The other theory I have about Turkish Delight in this novel, and it may not be a very good theory, is that its possible connection with Dorothy Sayers. We know Sayers and Lewis read each other's works, and indeed admired each other's works, and commented on each other's works in public, and wrote private letters to each other. And Turkish Delight is, of course, a significant feature in Sayers' novel Strong Poison. And I'll read you a passage from that novel now. It's towards the end, and I'm afraid this will be a bit of a spoiler for those of you who haven't read the novel and intend to, so perhaps rush on a few minutes. Chapter 22. Strong Poison. "Thank you," said Whimsy. "Do sit down. You have dined, of course, but you will have a cup of coffee. You prefer the Turkish variety, I fancy. My man brews it rather well." Mr. Urquhart accepted the offer and complimented Bunter on having achieved the right method of concocting that curiously syrupy brew, so offensive to the average Occidental. Bunter thanked him gravely for his good opinion and proffered a box of that equally nauseating mess called Turkish Delight, which not only gluts the palate and glues the teeth, but also smothers the consumer in a floury cloud of white sugar. Mr. Urquhart immediately plugged his mouth with a large lump of it, murmuring indistinctly that it was the genuine Eastern variety. Now, those of you who know that novel will know that Mr. Urquhart, again, go forward if you don't want spoilers, Mr. Urquhart is the murderer who has given arsenic to another character in order to kill them, and who has built up his own resistance to arsenic. Now, Whimsy is going to tell him in a few pages' time, "I know you're resistant to arsenic because all that floury sugar on the Turkish Delight is in fact arsenic powder, and you should be dead if you weren't, if you hadn't got an immunity to arsenic." And Urquhart's going to freak out and call him all sorts of names and gnash his teeth and say his murder has been discovered. Now, that just strikes me as a really interesting parallel, that the one novel ends with a character eating what is apparently poisoned Turkish Delight, although of course it isn't actually. Whimsy hasn't actually risked murdering the solicitor, but that novel ends with that way, and he's incidentally killed a member of his own family in order to divert money within the family in this novel. And then later, Lewis's novel begins with a man or a boy eating nauseous, glutinous Turkish Delight, and it poisoning him, it having a toxic moral effect on him, the idea that this Turkish Delight is rotting him somehow, it's making him less than he was, and it's turning him against his family, of course. Now, I don't have a lot of backing up for this theory. It's possibly undermined by the fact that Lewis said in one of his essays that one of the forms of popular fiction that he didn't have a passion for was detective fiction, that he didn't tend to read it and he preferred science fiction. So it's not a great theory, I'll admit, but we know he did read Dorothy Sayers and did really admire her work. So I'm just tempted to think that he got that image of poisonous Turkish Delight being eaten by a traitor to a family, and it found its way somehow into Narnia and became this inciting incident for the Edmund storyline and the much larger passion narrative that's going to come. So, those are my thoughts, as I say. I hope you might leave some of your thoughts in the comments. The next chapter we're going to discuss is called Back on This Side of the Door, and it runs from, because the game of hide-and-seek was still going on, it took Edmund and Lucy some time to find the others, and it runs all the way to Peter held the door closed but did not shut it, for, and you can probably guess what's coming, for of course he remembered, as every sensible person does, that you should never, never shut yourself up in a wardrobe. Well, I hope you won't be shutting yourself up in a wardrobe in the meantime, but I look forward to speaking to you about it soon.